So next week I will turn back to IT, OT discussions, Internet of Things. Please welcome David Mount from NetIQ. Good morning.
Good morning.
What's your role at NetIQ?
So I head up some solutions consulting across EMEA for identity access and security.
Okay, very good. So here's the presenter.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So good morning. When I was growing up, my parents used to say to me, Dave, don't live your life by what ifs. But, what if there were no more traffic jams? What if we didn't have to maintain things that weren't broken? And what if the world used energy in a far more efficient way? So, welcome to the Internet of Things, right? A world of hyperconnectivity where everything and everyone is connected. And we're surrounded by sensors that are collecting massive amounts of information and sharing that information with the sole goal of really kind of making our lives easier and making us as individuals more efficient. And so how did we get to where we are today? How did we see this kind of quantum leap in terms of connectivity? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. It's the massive sort of reduction in cost of things like the sensors, of the cost of bandwidth of sharing the information, the cost of processing of that information. It's the ubiquity of smartphones. It's the ubiquity of fast connectivity, Wi-Fi, fourth generation networks, and so forth. And then IP version 6. We now have enough IP addresses to assign one to every atom on the Earth, for this Earth, and for many, many Earths over. And also big data. We now have the technology and the capability to kind of process this massive volume and massive variety of data to help us kind of make sense of it. And with the Internet of Things, there are really two critical components. There are the things themselves, there are the sensors that are collecting that data, and there are the people behind the things. And it's the people whose privacy that we need to protect, but doing that whilst we're still enabling the sharing of data between the individuals, the things, and the systems that really kind of drives the efficiency that people are looking for. So let's take a look at some examples, right? So Hamburg, right, turning themselves into a smart city. And when you talk about the Internet of Things, you're going to get sick of hearing the word smart, right? Because smart, it's the code word for Internet of Things. But, Hamburg, they're turning themselves into a smart city. They have sensors in the roads around the ports, so they can enable kind of much more efficient movement of traffic around the ports. They are able to control the bridges to sort of maximize the shipping traffic, but also the road traffic as well to avoid delays. And things like parking. The parking spots look for the people rather than the people looking for the parking spots. And in terms of medicine, we've got medical devices that are implantable, that are ingestible, that are kind of sharing this information around enabling us to make better diagnosis, make better decisions around drug doses and things like this, and sharing this information. And I've got a very good friend of our family. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes a few years ago, and she's 13, and she has this device now that's implanted in her that Bluetooths to a separate device and monitoring her blood sugar levels and giving her guidance around insulin and things like this. So whilst we have all these benefits to the Internet of Things, there's also a dark side to it, right? So, how can I control the data that is being collected? Who's storing that data? Who's storing that information? And what are they doing with it? So, you would have seen fairly recently Samsung sort of announced that you've got to be really careful about what you say in front of a Samsung smart TV, right? Because it's potentially collecting the information sending that off to a third party for voice recognition, for commands, and so forth that way. So, who's storing that information? How's that being used? You've got this guy here in the Nottingham Hackspace in the UK, and he rigged up a vending machine that tweet shames people when they buy snacks. So what he's able to do is kind of marry the snack choice that is made with the identity of the individual that is purchasing it. So if he can do that, what else can be done with that sort of identity information? Right, you may be familiar with the Fitbit, right? These fitness and activity tracking bands. So the Florida International University, they wrote a paper that they'd been able to reverse engineer the Fitbit and identify a number of vulnerabilities. And what they did was they created a suite of tools called Fitbit. And what Fitbit is able to do is it's able to read and modify data on the Fitbit tracking band within a radius of 15 feet. Now, if you think about the data that's contained on that device, so things like my username, my location, my height, my weight, my fitness data. Now, some people might consider that information or some of that information to be fairly benign, but people need to realize that having access to that sort of information opens you up to some very, very targeted social engineering that enables individuals to try and get at the data that they really want to get at. And while some of these ideas you may sort of think, well, they're not necessarily too serious, you've now got the situations where kind of SCADA control systems are being connected to the publicly addressable internet. And we have this example of a German steel mill that was attacked, and the attackers prevented the furnace from being shut down in a normal way. And so you have situations where the impact of the attacks can be instant and can be devastating. So we need this, we need to have the control. And PricewaterhouseCoopers, they did in their State of Cybercrime survey, they sort of announced that, the Internet of Things is having this massive impact, and we're seeing sort of a whole new world of threats that is being introduced. And the EU, they did some further research, but they make a point that, well, actually, the threats that exist are not new. What's happened is the sheer scale of the Internet of Things just amplifies the vulnerabilities and the threats that we already know and we already understand related to internet-connected devices. So, how do we manage the risks, right? So we need to focus on the identity. The identity is the one thing that we have under our control. And it's the one thing that enables us to balance the needs of the user with the needs of the risk professional. And we know that a lot of the risks, a lot of the threats that exist around the Internet of Things, they're not new. So we know that we've already got too many users with too much access in our environments. And when we bring that into the Internet of Things, well, we have too many devices with too much access. And we've just got this massive kind of explosion in the attack surface that has been created through the Internet of Things. And one thing we can't do is leave it to the manufacturers of the devices to plan to address some of these problems. They're very, very focused on making these devices very easy to use, easy to connect, and easy to interchange data. And some might say they do that at the expense of security. So, we can't stop the attacks from occurring, and we have to accept that at some point, we're going to see attackers in our environments. So what we have to do is work to mitigate the damage. So how do we do that? Well, from an identity and an access perspective, we need to focus on the basics. We need to minimize the rights of the individuals. We need to make sure that the access rights that an individual has, the device has, the thing has, is appropriate. And then we need to enforce the access controls, and we need to monitor user activity. We need to make sure that the activity that is occurring is appropriate for that particular device, that it's normal. But how do we understand if activity is appropriate? And the answer is not more data. We already have too many tools that are generating too much data to enable us to make sense of it. And if you look at some of the recent breaches that would have been in the press over the last sort of 18 months or so, things like Target, for example, the signs were there for those attacks. It was just very difficult to really understand and pinpoint what was happening within the sheer volume of data that existed. So, simply put, there is too much noise and not enough insight. And so security needs context. And if you take a look at sort of identity and security, these two things are no longer separate silos and separate domains within an organization. Identity needs security, and security needs identity. So what we need is this context. We need to understand the identity. We need to understand the who. We need to understand, is this individual who they say they are? What access have they got? What are their entitlements? And how are they using those entitlements? And is that use normal for that individual, for that type of individual within our organization? Because it's that helps us really kind of understand, is this normal user access? Or is this an individual who's been compromised, or is there an attack in progress? So, the key to delivering the context is identity. And as we build this kind of environment and build this new world of hyperconnectivity, we must adopt this kind of identity-centric thinking if we want to have any control over this world that we're building. And so, with this kind of internet of everything, we need to have a parallel kind of identity of everything if we want to have this manageability. And we need that identity of everything, because if what we need to be able to do is ascribe behavior to the things, we need to be able to track that behavior. And we need to understand and identify when that behavior is normal or abnormal. So, the identity of everything, allows us to kind of assign these attributes so we can really start to understand who or what the connected item or person is, what permissions and entitlements do they have, what are they doing with those entitlements, who granted the permissions in the first place. And we can then start to determine how other people and other devices can interact with us. And this is going to become pretty complex, right? It's going to be very hierarchical, and it's going to be very matrixed. And, a classic example, the Google Nest, right? It's the home automation hub there. It's collecting data from other appliances and sensors around the home, and it's sharing some of that information. But there's a homeowner that sits behind it, and there's a homeowner identity. And that homeowner identity is who Google wants to market to, right? And that owner and that identity has other relationships with other individuals and other things that they're using. So it's a very kind of complex and matrix kind of environment. So in terms of NetIQ, what are we doing is kind of working to build that environment across identity, access, and security, doing a lot of work with Cisco around the identity services engine and making sure that kind of these networks that are being built moving forward are very much sort of self-defending, and so forth, because this is going to be absolutely necessary when you think about we might have 2 or 3 devices today. It's not going to be too long before we have 20 or 30 devices each that want to connect and want to start sharing data and start sharing information. So in terms of actions for today, what do we need to do? Well, we need to understand the identity stores that we already have in place. And then we want to examine, well, how do we use identity information in our organizations today? We want to look for ways that we can integrate identity context in what we do, so we can start to understand behavior, and we can start to understand the sensors and the things and how they're going to interact moving forward. And we need to start to build a framework that can handle much more sophisticated and aggregate identity information, and importantly, a framework that can scale, because we're talking about many, many millions of identities that are going to impact organizations that are not necessarily expecting that sheer scale of identity information. And then we need to work towards that kind of extensible identity framework that's going to encompass the people, the products, the devices, and the services that work together around Internet of Things. So thank you very much. That's me. And any questions? We're based outside, happy to discuss further. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
David.
you.
I'm not sure whether I'm totally following your idea of everything need to be identity-centric. Let me give an example,
Okay.
and maybe you can reply and see,
Sure.
give your views. A car.
Uh-huh.
So you have, I don't know, I think 2,000 identities in a car, something like that, in an S-Class Mercedes. How would you address that?
So I think we have to kind of, is building those relationships and understanding the identities themselves, the relationships they have, and what control we need to have over those identities. And you're absolutely right. It's massively complex. And do we have a grasp on the challenge in total yet? No, absolutely. And it's something that's evolving. But we've got to set up the framework to allow us to kind of understand, as those identities evolve, how are we going to want to manage those moving forward and control the relationships between them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you again.